He was a good man and easy to meet and talk to, but Cassidy was a bad man. Welcome to the Rediscover the Winds Podcast, a podcast by the Fremont County Museums. With museums in Du Bois, Riverton, and Lander, the Fremont County Museum System is committed to collecting, preserving, and interpreting the stories of Fremont County and the Wind River area. The unique artifacts found at our museums relate the history of central Wyoming with information which in many cases can't be found anywhere else. With the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we hope to bring some of that history to you, wherever you are listening. Last episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast, we talked about Wyoming women's suffrage in South Pass City. This episode will focus on the Wild West and, in particular, Butch Cassidy and his adventures in Fremont County. Early Wyoming, with its few towns and even fewer sheriffs, constituted a part of the notorious Wild West. For about 30 years, the frontier territories west of the Mississippi River were famous for cowboys and Indians, lawmen, gunslingers, prospectors, gambling, outlaws, and gangs. One of the most famous of these outlaws, popularized by Butch Cassidy in The Sundance Kid in 1969, starring Paul Newman, was Butch Cassidy himself. The real story of Butch Cassidy, born Robert Leroy Parker, is full of mysteries. He is sometimes described as the Robin Hood of Western outlaws, reportedly never killing a man and always showing kindness to friends, family, and those less fortunate. However, little is known about Cassidy's life and death. In his outlaw days, Cassidy ranged across Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, and further. He was most famous for daring train robberies and bank heists, targeting enormous payloads, but was almost never caught, usually peripherally implicated in the crimes. More than 60 stories stretching across 8 decades describe Butch Cassidy's death, and even descendants of his own family are sometimes at odds over what happened. While we may never know who Butch Cassidy really was, we do know that he spent some of his early outlaw days in Fremont County and may have even returned following his death. Robert Leroy Parker was born in Beaver, Utah on April 13, 1866. He was the eldest of 13 children. His parents, Maximilian and Anne Giles Parker, were devout Mormons. They immigrated to the United States from England, crossing the country in a grueling wagon train in 1856. After some time in Beaver, the Parker family relocated to a ranch in Circleville, Utah. In Circleville, around 1879, Robert met a young ranch hand and small-time outlaw, Mike Cassidy, on a neighboring ranch belonging to the Marshall brothers. According to some, the ranch was a place for illegal activities. Robert Parker and Mike Cassidy struck up an immediate friendship, and Mike taught Robert how to ride, rope, shoot, and rustle livestock. At the time, livestock rustling was an easy way to grow one's own holdings, capturing cows and branding them in order to lay claim to them. Despite being illegal, the act was widely practiced across the West. It is supposedly because of his relationship with Mike Cassidy that Parker would later adopt his surname as an alias. At the age of 18, Robert left home. Lula Parker Bettinson, Robert's youngest sister, claimed he left after taking the claim for a local wrestling incident to clear the charges against 2 married men, Fred and Charlie. However, no legal record of this exists. Another story is that Fred and Charlie, along with Robert, were watching the town herd of cattle. Thieves who stole some cattle convinced Robert to sign a false bill of sale for them, and Robert took the fall for the incident. Whatever the story, Robert drifted to Colorado and Wyoming, living as a cattle rustler and using hideouts in Browns Park, a remote area at the intersection of Utah, Colorado, and Wyoming, and maybe even in the hole-in-the-wall country of the southern Bighorn Mountains in northern Wyoming. During his time of drifting, Robert interacted with several other outlaws in the area. Notably, he fell in with Matt Warner, another man traveling the outlaw trail, riding with him for some time. Warner is sometimes credited with providing Robert the nickname Butch. He claimed that he had once owned a gun with such a bad kick that it was called the Butch. When Robert fired it in front of Warner and several other outlaws, it dropped him on his back, and thereafter he was known as Butch. However, Lula, Robert's youngest sister, claimed that he often worked in butcher shops in Wyoming and was therefore nicknamed Butch. No matter the origins, Butch Cassidy was not in frequent use by the press until after 1896, and Robert Parker more often went by George Cassidy during his outlaw days. Most people believed Cassidy played a role in the Telluride, Colorado robbery of the San Miguel Valley Bank on June 14, 1889. It is said that together Matt Warner, Warner's brother-in-law Tom McCarthy, Cassidy, and another man organized the bank robbery. The four successfully stole a large amount of funds and evaded capture afterwards. However, newspapers did not widely report Cassidy in connection with the robbery, and he may not have been involved entirely. Regardless, following this event, Robert came north to the Bighorn Basin in the upper Wind River Valley of the Wyoming Territory. In 1889, shortly after Butch arrived in Fremont County, Wyoming, he met and partnered with the cowboy Al Hainer. Little is known about Hainer. Some believe he was a fellow Mormon from Utah and that even his name was an alias, as was common among many of the outlaws of the time. Hainer and Cassidy likely settled on Horse Creek, north of DuBois. It is believed that the pair may have been working for the Embar Cattle Ranch, which was originally in that location. The pair stayed with Hugh Yeomans, one of DuBois's first settlers, in the fall of 1889, and may have even helped Yeomans construct his cabin. Originally, the settlement of DuBois was located about a mile further north on Horse Creek than where it is today. In 1889, the loose collection of residents and squatters was just beginning to grow large enough for there to be demand for a post office. At the same time, Owen Wister was visiting the DuBois area as well. Wister was at the time a young writer and lawyer from the East. In 1902, he would publish his most famous novel, The Virginian, but in 1889 he was still a young dude visiting Wyoming. Wister stayed at the cabin of Charles C. Smith, the first postmaster in DuBois. The DuBois post office had just been established by Smith the year prior. As the post office was established, the name of the settlement had barely been decided. Stories as to the naming of DuBois vary. The most common version of the story contends that Smith originally applied with the name Thibault for the post office, meaning white man in Shoshone. The choice of name may have been in honor of Smith's employer, J.K. Moore, owner of the first general store in Fort Washakie. However, Smith's name was turned down, and the more appropriate choice of DuBois, after an Idaho senator, Eugene Dubois, was given instead. While Smith was the one who applied for the post office, J.K. Moore's son James remembered that the post office was named by Hugh Yeomans instead. Other stories contend that Smith was largely illiterate and Yeomans helped him put together the submission and handle the mail. By 1890, Yeomans was the postmaster in his own right. It's possible that Butch Cassidy and Al Hainer helped construct the second site of the DuBois post office during a time when the name DuBois had barely been established. Cassidy and Hainer may have also worked on the E.A. Ranch. Eugene Amoretti Jr. was a prominent lander banker whose DuBois area ranch carried his initials. E.A. Ranch, it's in his name. Cassidy became friends with Amoretti, and according to his son, Cassidy deposited large sums of money into Amoretti's bank, possibly in connection with his take from the Telluride, Colorado robbery. It's rumored that Amoretti bought property from Cassidy and Hainer, but no record of this transaction can be found. It's possible, instead, that by paying off a mortgage, the two outlaws were winning Amoretti's loyalty, building up goodwill in the area. Records still exist of smaller deposits from Cassidy and Hainer into Amoretti's bank during this period. Notably, no Amoretti-owned banks were robbed during Butch Cassidy's outlaw days. Cassidy and other outlaws were known for aiding local businesses and ranches in order for them to turn a blind eye to their activities. It is possible that Cassidy's friendship with Amoretti was a related attempt to keep his own money safe and Amoretti appeased. Amoretti's E.A. Ranch was originally located east of DuBois at the confluence of the Wind River and Jakey's Fork. At this time, the E.A. Ranch foreman was John Simpson. Simpson's wife, Maggie, cooked and washed for the ranch's cowboys. The Simpson family befriended Cassidy, and some even say Cassidy and Hayner spent Christmas of 1889 with the Simpson family at their cabin. According to the Simpson family, Cassidy rode 120 miles round trip to the doctor at Fort Washakie during a blizzard in order to get medicine for their youngest child who was sick with influenza. However, some researchers have claimed that the Simpson family didn't yet have a child in 1889, let alone one who was sick from an influenza outbreak. Nonetheless, Cassidy managed to earn the trust of the Simpson family that winter. Andrew Manseau, an early homesteader in Du Bois, claimed, quote, "Butch Cassidy and Al Hayner spent one winter on a place above me. They had some racehorses and bought a blue joint hay for me. I charged them big prices." However, Manseau was wary of these visitors, also noting that, quote, "He was good company and easy to meet and talk to, but Cassidy was a bad man." Cassidy's personality was an instrumental part of his legend. As a Robin Hood figure, he was known to be personable and charismatic. The Wyoming State Journal reports Will Simpson, a Lander attorney who knew Cassidy, saying, quote, "It cannot be said that anyone brightened up at the sight of Al Hayner, but Cassidy brought the spirit of frolic with him. Before dinner, those who grinned in silence were beginning to laugh out loud." Cassidy was well known in Lander, frequenting Lanigan's saloon, and well liked enough that he was bailed out twice following his arrests by locals. Sometime in 1890, Cassidy and Hayner reportedly left Du Bois for Johnson County, Wyoming. They might have traveled on to Hole in the Wall, a pass in the Bighorn Mountains already infamous as an outlaw hideout. Reportedly, the position was so tight that any number of intruders could easily be fended off by a dozen men with rifles. Although their stay was brief, stories of the outlaws' time in town are numerous. While Hayner and Cassidy left the Du Bois area, their time in Fremont County was far from complete. In August of 1891, Cassidy and Hayner were back in Fremont County, passing between Horse Creek and the Keene Sabe Ranch, near modern-day Shoshone. Supposedly, Butch Cassidy either ran the ranch or owned it, although no records exist today of either case. They stopped to rest at a ranch, and there encountered Billy Nutcher with 3 horses. Cassidy liked the horses enough to buy them off of Nutcher without asking for any further papers. Later that month, Otto Frank, Justice of the Peace and owner of the large Pitchfork Ranch in Bighorn Basin, brought a complaint for his neighbor, Richard Answorth, to the Fremont County Court, as the Bighorn Basin was part of the county at that time. He claimed that the pair stole a horse worth $40 from the Gray Bull Cattle Company. The pair were long gone from Fremont County, and the ensuing manhunt traced them to Evanston and eventually up into Star Valley. Hayner was arrested with little difficulty, but Cassidy put up more of a fight before being beaten and captured by Deputy Bob Calvary. They were returned to Lander and jailed. Fremont County prosecuting attorney James Vidal charged Cassidy and Hayner with grand larceny in 1892. Friends of both Cassidy and Hayner came to their aid, releasing the pair on a $400 bond per man. Butch's trial was delayed for over a year, beginning in June 20th, 1893. In the interim, the prosecuting attorney Vidal had not been reelected, and the new county prosecutor was Butch's longtime friend Will Simpson, whose family Butch regularly visited. Another one of Cassidy's friends, Du Bois banker Eugene Amoretti Jr., was also a member of the jury. Neither Cassidy nor Hayner denied possessing the horse, instead claiming to have legally purchased it from Billy Nutcher. Only a few days before, Nutcher's brother Joe was found complicit in the theft of horses from the Padlock Ranch. Although evidence proved that Billy, not Joe, was the real thief, Billy had fled to Nebraska. Cassidy and Hayner were found not guilty. Relentless in his pursuit of them, Otto Frank filed a second complaint for a different horse, once it was clear that Cassidy and Hayner would be cleared of their crime. Once again, both men were charged with stealing a horse, this time one from the ZT Ranch. Once again, they were both released on $400 bond posted by rancher Eli Sr. and hotel keeper Leonard Short. Once again, Will Simpson prosecuted the trial, but this time, Butch Cassidy was not so lucky. On July 4th, 1894, the jury found Al Hainer not guilty and George Butch Cassidy guilty of all things for stealing a $5 horse. Some people have suggested that Hainer may have turned on Cassidy. Cassidy was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor at the Wyoming State Penitentiary in Laramie. Sheriff of Fremont County Charles Stowe was responsible for transporting Cassidy and 5 other criminals to the state penitentiary. He arranged a party including Deputy Harry Lauge, Town Constable Henry Hank Bedecker, J.C. Baldwin, and 1 additional unnamed guard. Henry Hank Bedecker was a pioneer lawman. Originally, he came to Wyoming from Nebraska following the death of his youngest son and first wife, Josephine, acting as a hunter and guide in a survey outfit. However, the area in the late 1880s was full of lawlessness as the cattle and sheep wars played out, and Bedecker found himself drawn into working as both marshal and deputy sheriff. Eventually, the demand for lawmen fell, and Bedecker filed for 2 different homesteads in the upper Wind River Valley in the late 1890s. Ultimately, Hank Bedecker, his second wife, and children proved up the claim on a spot just above Wiggins Fork. Around the homestead, there was plentiful wildlife, notably bighorn sheep. Bedecker became one of the area's best bighorn sheep hunters, often called on as a guide. A multi-talented pioneer, Bedecker dabbled in many other talents outside of guiding and homesteading, serving as a dentist, barber, carpenter, cobbler, veterinarian, musician, and photographer as the demand came. Bedecker had even built his own makeshift darkroom, developing photographs of his family and scenic photos of the area. One hunting trip, a doctor from Omaha photographed Bedecker standing, holding his Winchester rifle over a particularly spectacular bighorn ram. On his return to Omaha, the doctor provided the photograph to his local arms store, which liked it so much that it was blown up and displayed outside the store at full life size. Winchester Repeating Arms Company learned of this, eventually licensing the picture from Bedecker, using it for calendars, posters, and advertisements during the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. By 1917, Bedecker sold his homestead to his eldest son, Elmer, and moved his family to a new location. However, at the time, Lander had been run over by the same old problem: outlaws and criminality. Called by the mayor of Lander in 1921 to take over as its marshal, Bedecker immediately relocated to the town, spending the next 10 years straightening it out. The lawmen from Lander transported Cassidy and other criminals to Rawlins by buckboard, camping along the way. They caught the train from Rawlins on to Laramie and the state penitentiary. On their arrival, the prison warden's A.W. Adams was horrified to find Cassidy not in shackles. According to the Wyoming State Journal, Cassidy retorted, quote, "Honor among thieves, I guess." He would remain there for 18 months. In 1895, Hainer was tried in Lander yet again for stealing cattle, once again found not guilty when his partner, Jake Snyder, was. Little is known about Hainer's origin, and his name was in all likelihood a pseudonym. Ed Farlow, prominent Lander area pioneer, claimed to know many of the outlaws of the area, grouping Al Hainer with Cassidy, Elzie Lay, Jake Snyder, who was imprisoned for cattle stealing when Hainer was again found not guilty, Mike Brown, and Kisei Yads. However, unlike Cassidy, Hainer remained in Fremont County following the arrest and trial. In 1897, the Wind River Mountaineer reported, quote, "Marion Olive and Al Hainer have taken a bunch of 2,500 ewes of Earl and Fosher on shares and will go out to the range about the 1st of October. Marion and Al are all right and will make a success of the sheep business." Apparently, Olive and Hainer made a moderate success of things, at least, Olive taking to the new life of the sheepherder well. The Wind River Mountaineer consistently reported on the partners undertaking sheep activities as the firm Hainer and Olive from 1897 to 1899, although after the turn of the century, the partnership seemingly dissolved. By 1905, Marion Olive had relocated to Alberta, Canada, and after 1899, Al Hainer disappeared from newspaper records, perhaps giving up the name or moving on elsewhere. Little is known about Cassidy's time in jail, but according to some accounts, he was a model prisoner. After serving only 18 months of a 2-year sentence, he was released in early 1896. While difficult to confirm, some researchers theorized Cassidy was embittered by such a long imprisonment for such a small sentence. Cassidy's feelings notwithstanding, following release from the penitentiary, he began to organize a wider gang of outlaws and criminals. The group were sometimes known as the Cassidy Gang or the Wild Bunch. They were the most successful robbers of the period. Cassidy and his gang made allies of ranchers by supposedly paying off their mortgages and giving money to the poor. As a result, Cassidy and the Wild Bunch were often known as local Robin Hoods. The Wild Bunch used hideouts from Arizona's Mogollon Rim and Utah's Robbers Roost to South Dakota's Black Hills. Their popular Wyoming hideouts included Browns Park, Hoback Canyon, Hole in the Wall, Powder Wash, the Red Desert, Star Valley, Wind River Canyon, and the Wind River Mountains. The notoriety of Cassidy's gang began soon after his release. On August 13, 1896, Cassidy, his frequent partner Elza Lay, and Bub Meeks robbed over $7,000 from the Montpelier Bank in Idaho. Supposedly, the robbery was conducted to acquire funds for the defense of another Cassidy gang member, Matt Warner. While the take was not the group's largest, it established Cassidy as a ringleader in the robberies and started the legend of Butch Cassidy and his robbing of banks and trains to help himself and sometimes those in need. Tales abound of bank and stagecoach robberies throughout Wyoming committed by the Wild Bunch, but there are only 2 confirmed crimes: the robberies of Union Pacific trains at Wilcox and Tipton. On June 2, 1889, the Wild Bunch committed their most infamous crime when they commandeered a Union Pacific train near Wilcox, blew open the baggage car with dynamite, and stole more than $50,000 in gold, cash, jewelry, and banknotes before escaping on horseback. The train had been carrying gold meant to pay the troops fighting in the Spanish-American War, and as a result, the robbery was covered in the national news. Cassidy was labeled by many as a terrorist, and a bounty of $18,000 was put on the heads of him and his gang. But Cassidy's involvement in the Wilcox robbery has never been fully established. The Pinkerton Detective Agency felt many outlaws could have been responsible, and not just Cassidy. The hasty retreat by the men who committed the crime pointed to poor planning, which was not a trademark of a Cassidy hit. Regardless, the gang of outlaws was pursued for weeks by a posse funded by the Union Pacific before disappearing into the country around Hole in the Wall. The second confirmed Wyoming Wild Bunch crime occurred on August 2, 1900, when another Union Pacific train was dynamited near Tipton, Wyoming. Union Pacific staff claimed that its bandits made off with only $54, but it's unlikely such a small amount had been stolen. It's believed that the railroad was lying in order to cover up how vulnerable their trains were to the Western outlaws, and estimates of the true theft extend up to $100,000. Again, it is unclear if Cassidy himself was present during the robbery, but 2 bits of evidence suggest he may have been. The Tipton train robbers appear to have been well prepared, hiding fresh horses every 20 miles or so, and this was supposedly a trademark of Cassidy's getaways. The Wyoming Tribune of Cheyenne quoted the train's conductor, Kerrigan, his memory as he was being guarded by one of the robbers. Quote, "The one who stood guard over conductor Kerrigan asked, 'What time is it?' Kerrigan pulled out his watch and said, 'I suppose you want this too.' 'No,' answered the bandit, 'we don't want anything from the railroad boys.' Then, a minute later, the outlaw had disappeared into the darkness with the genuine goodbye, boys." Following the Robin Hood aura around him, Cassidy was supposedly polite to those he robbed and only took from the richest passengers in takes. However, it was reportedly not just Cassidy who had a sense of honor. Ed Farlow recounts the story of a man called Slick Corden, loosely associated with some other outlaws. Slick learned of a sheep herder who had just collected his wages and eventually waylaid out and shot at the man. However, the herder got away, returning to town and identifying the assailant, who was immediately placed under arrest. Eventually, Slick was run down by the members of his former gang, who claimed he was no longer part of the group. One of the outlaws, Mike Brown, commented, quote, "We may be a bad bunch, but we don't go around shooting hard-working men for their hard-earned wages." That is the way the old-time Western outlaws used to live, Farlow added. They were a pretty square bunch, in spite of the fact that they were cattle rustlers, bank robbers, and highwaymen. By 1901, most of Cassidy's fellow outlaws and friends had either been captured, killed, or on the run. Cassidy, reportedly feeling his outlaw life was ending, left New York in 1901 with his most frequent partner, Henry Longbach, the Sundance Kid. According to some, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid purchased a ranch in Cholia, Argentina, until they fell under suspicion by authorities. Cassidy popped up later in Bolivia, mining and engaging in robberies. It is here in San Vicente, Bolivia, that some believe Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were killed during a gunfight with local police. Others believe that Cassidy managed to escape to the United States during a different name, the men from the shootout unrelated to American outlaws. According to stories from Josie Bassett, one of Cassidy's early girlfriends, Hank Bedecker, Lander Lawman, and various family members, Cassidy returned to Browns Park, Colorado, Fremont County, Wyoming, and Circleville, Utah in the 1920s. Others believe it was well-known Cassidy impersonator William T. Phillips, alias William Wilcox, who returned to Cassidy's old haunts, especially those in Wyoming, searching for Cassidy's hidden gold, supposedly cached in the Wind River Mountains. Cassidy visited Farlow's townhome at least twice. Farlow claimed he saw Cassidy at the Noble Hotel, where he and Hank Bedecker, the old lawman who had taken Cassidy to the penitentiary back in 1895, all spoke. Quote, "The old fogies and town gossips sat nearby with their ears cracked wide open, trying to overhear our conversation," said Farlow. "Because of that, we couldn't talk of things I had very much wanted to ask about. I believe Cassidy would have told us of many of his escapades throughout his career of outlawry, although he did say at the time that he was not very proud of a number of things he had done." Bob Bedecker, son of Hank, seemingly confirmed the story. In 1970, in a letter addressed to Lula Parker Bettison, Cassidy's youngest sister, he recounted that in 1929, when running the Frontier Cafe in Du Bois, quote, "Butch Cassidy and two young fellows came in the cafe and had T-bones, and Butch Cassidy talked to me for hours about the old-timers around Lander." Cassidy is supposedly buried in dozens of spots around the United States, including Johnny, Nevada, where he may have died in a mining accident, or on the Little Spokane River in Washington. He's also reportedly been killed and buried in Europe and Central and South America. But like so much of his life, almost everything is open for interpretation. Cassidy's true gravesite is most likely lost to time. The Wild West is a particularly vivid period in American history, and most places in the West have ties to one outlaw or another. However, Fremont County has the distinction of being closely tied to the infamous Butch Cassidy, and more so than most. The county was the site of the crime that earned him his only arrest and imprisonment. The upper Wind River Valley saw Cassidy attempting to ranch and homestead before he began his spree of robberies that would make him a legend, instead becoming charismatic George Butch Cassidy in the earliest days of Du Bois to its people. It makes sense, then, that if Cassidy did return from South America, he would return to this spot in Wyoming, if for nothing else than to reminisce and search for his cached gold. That's it for this episode of the Rediscover the Winds podcast. Next episode, we'll talk on the sheep and cattle wars in Wyoming. Rediscover the Winds, a Wyoming history podcast, is brought to you in part by the Wind River Cultural Centers Foundation. The WRCCF is a non-profit organization dedicated to helping Fremont County museums preserve our Wyoming and Wind River cultural and natural history by directly supporting the efforts of the Du Bois Museum, the Pioneer Museum in Lander, and the Riverton Museum. To learn more, visit www.windriverccf.com and help us conserve our past while enriching our present.